Hi, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the 97 UX Things podcast. Dan Berlin here, your book editor and host. I'm joined this week by Morgane Peng, who wrote the Not All Interfaces Need to Be Simplified chapter. Welcome, Morgane.
Hey, Dan. Thanks for having me today.
Welcome, and thanks for writing your chapter and for joining me. Can you tell folks a little bit about you?
Yeah, well, my name is Morgane Peng. I'm originally from France, but I live in Hong Kong, Osaka, and now I've settled in London. I'm a design director at Societe Generale, so it's a French financial group. And I work on the corporate and investment banking side. And so basically to give an idea of what we do with the team, we design products and experiences on the business to business side. So for startups, corporates, financial institutions, etc.
Mm-hmm. And do you tend to work more in research, design, a little of both?
Everything. I mean, with the team, not me personally, because I'll be too stretched, sorry.
Yep.
But with the team, yeah, we do cover everything that goes from research to prototyping, usability testing. We have a design system council, user research council, etc. So the team has grown over the years.
Gotcha. Great. And how large is your team?
So we're about 20-ish. So, and the team is split between London and Paris.
Gotcha. So thanks for that. Next, can you tell us a little bit about your career trajectory, how you got started in UX, how you discovered UX, and how you got to where you are today?
Yeah, there's many ways to break into UX, and I guess mine is one of the many ways to do it. So I originally studied finance at school, and I did a business school, and so I first worked on financial products. So I was explaining them to investors, and so I did that in Paris and Hong Kong, and basically little by little we started to have more and more explanations to do on the different kind of digital channels we had. And I like to say that I was actually an undercover designer, because I was doing freelance design work on the side, but completely unrelated, because it was mainly in video games design. So
I see.
Very far from finance.
Yep.
And so basically one day my two activities clicked together, because at work we realized that we really wanted to have a real in-house design capacity and vision. And we needed to do this study to see how we could build that. And to be honest, UX back then, I think that was 10 years ago, it wasn't really a word that was very known, and especially not
Right.
less in Europe, I would say. But we knew that we had to, the same way that we train on Salesforce, we say we have one voice for salespeople. We knew that we had to have the same cohesive voice on the web. And so this is how basically I started to study, and little by little I discovered more of it, and I started to hire the first designer in the team, and basically this is how we build up the whole thing.
Okay, great. And you've been with the same company since then?
Yes. So actually someone said once that it was very interesting to follow me, because basically the trajectory of design is kind of basically starting with me.
Yep.
We had designers before, but it's the classic story of the lone designers kind of sprinkled around the
Sure.
organization, siloed and alone. And we really wanted to build this kind of in-house capacity to be able to really have a vision and have a set of practices that can scale. And so I started alone on a few projects with some methodologies, and then we hired more people who kind of brought with them their expertise. I like to say that I remember there was once a time where we were not doing user flows. So basically the first designer came, he was like, what? Okay, we need to do user flows. And then, little by little, then we had what? Oh, okay, we need design system. What? Oh, we need user research. And this is how we kind of build the whole team.
Piece by piece.
Yes. That's I would say that's being able to take the time to hire well, and take time to fit, to have this team culture that builds up little by little, is kind of a luxury, Because I know that, sometimes companies suddenly they realize that everyone's doing design and, they suddenly want to hire 100 people, but you can't expect 100 people to just join and magically work together.
Right. Right. It's interesting that you mentioned that in terms of building it piece by piece. How about getting started, getting to build that team and starting to build that team? Do you have any tips for folks who are looking to build their UX team and how they can do so?
Oh, that's a very wide question. It's interesting. I would say that when you're starting to build a team, you may want to look for a very specific mindset, because basically the people who's going to join your team, it's kind of, okay, it's great because it's kind of all, a blank page. You have to write everything. You have to build decide on your tools, build your methodologies, your processes, but you also have to do a lot of kind of organizational work. Sometimes you may face people who don't understand anything about design, so you really have to have this kind of early settler mindset. And I think definitely, like when we hired our first designers in the team, they had this mindset. Also because they didn't know much about finance and banking, but they had maybe families who worked in there, so they were kind of already a bit familiar with the pain points when they heard their families talking about the different challenges they face at work. And I think now know that obviously once your team has grown and you have all the different capabilities, we can hire more now for potential. So not someone who has a specific skill set. Like for example, as I said before, we're not even doing user flows, and then we had to hire someone who was more, I would say, stronger in visual designs for a design system. But now we kind of have the luxury to choose, okay, this person has potential, let's just bring that person in and see what happens. Yep. But yeah, at the beginning, I think you have to be very strategic to what kind of skill set and mindset you want in the team.
Great
it's
points.
Not easy.
Yep. Great. Thanks for all that. Now, your chapter, Not All Interfaces Need to Be Simplified. Can you tell us about that, please?
Oh, yeah. So I'm going to expand on my work, actually, because as I said, I've worked primarily in finance. And so now it's been several years I've been working in complex design. So as I said, for financial professionals, employees. So it can be anything from trading platforms, financial platforms, tools we use internally. And I think due to the fact that I was on the business side before, I never really fell into the trap of trying to oversimplify your tools. But this is a trend I've seen more and more, and especially, you may have seen, like the before UX, after UX on
right
on LinkedIn, Dribble, Medium, etc. And I think it's because part of this trend, because as designers we like to be very visual, to make something very visually pleasing and minimalist, and so that kind of leads into the tendency of removing all the information. And I've seen that more and more into during our design interviews, where we meet candidates and they just know about consumer products, or maybe because they've been doing a boot camp or like a very short training, so they are very, very kind of biased, and they only know about consumer products. So they think that everything should be as simple as, I don't know, an iPhone. And when they look at our screens, because sometimes I would give them an example, they were like, "Whoa, my God, I would never be able to use that." But they're not financial advisors, and we're not asking them to be financial advisors. And so I realized they're kind of projecting their own mental model or what should be good for the users without even having, without even sometimes talking to the users. And in my case, it's professional users.
Yep.
So, and to be honest, we actually made this mistake. I remember when we had the first designers, we kind of transformed a trading application into something super, super simple. It was glorious, progressive disclosure, step by step, etc. And when we shared that with the stakeholders, they looked at it and they were like, "Oh my God, this user experience is terrible," but in a bad way.
What happened there?
So we were kind of expecting we've done everything right. We've put all the labels, forms like white space, like progressive disclosures. But actually what happened is for them, when they are thinking about a financial product, they're kind of thinking, several attributes together. Mm-hmm. It's a bit like, I suppose, I guess there's probably people more familiar with design, but when you talk about typography, you have letter spacing, line heights, etc. So it's not just like one thing. There's a set of attributes that comes with styling. And for them, so the same way we think about styling in design, they think about a set of attributes in financial products. Mm-hmm. So if you start to break it down, you're kind of stopping them in the flow of thinking the product. So it's actually kind of this oversimplified interface is not helping them at all. It's kind of just stopping them in their flow of work.
Right.
We like to say, stay in the flow. So it's the same for designers and for professionals in finance. They want to be in the flow of their work. So when we put all those, stoppers, it's not helping at all.
And what would help their flow of work? Is it having all the information on the screen at once? Is it are there strategies here?
Oh, so that's when it's overcomplicated, because when we can't decide, we're just going to put everything. And this is how you end up, with the kind of cliche of the super convoluted screens, etc. So I'm not saying that we need to put everything on one screen, but there's a balance to attain. And basically that's actually the whole content of my chapter is how do we find the right balance between the not overcomplicated and not the oversimplified. Mm-hmm. And especially as designers who have to work in this complex space, how do we do to survive? Because we are not experts, whether it's in finance or healthcare or whatever. Actually, it's very funny because I've seen some screens, because in healthcare you have the screens that we see, for example, when you run or when you, for example, use Apple Health. Mm-hmm. But then if you've seen how they redesigned the screens for, doctors, it's completely different. There's like so many acronyms, a lot of data viz in one small screens, but that's what they need. And again, that's kind of expanding on my chapter, but basically, how do you find it? Well, you have to manage this complexity as designers, understand that you won't understand everything, because understanding everything is basically learning a new job, but there's still ways. So you have to know what is useful for you to know, and what are the things, honestly, you don't need to know. Like even for me, working 10 years in design, financial design, sometimes when they talk about very advanced modeling, I think my brain just shuts. Mm-hmm. It's like, okay, Morgane, they can talk about it because they need to make some decisions, but I do not need to know this.
Right.
That's too much info.
The nitty-gritty.
Exactly.
Yep.
What I like to say, it's, we talk a lot about, design with them, not for them in accessibility. It's the same here. You need to involve the users, because they will tell you if something is a market practice and, that's how they do their job, or if it's some kind of legacy, behavior that they kind of had to adopt because something was not optimized and not designed for them. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of all this that I wanted to cover in the chapter.
Nice. And you just mentioned accessibility. That brought to mind a question in terms of, all right, if the interface is less simple, are there any challenges in terms of accessibility and presenting that information in an accessible way?
That's interesting. That's an interesting question. Because very often, in terms of accessibility, we talk, for example, about keyboard navigation. And actually, keyboard navigation is something that people who are expert request a lot, because they want to go fast and they want to be able to do everything by keyboard. Actually, when you observe someone using a tool or even like designers, when we use our design tool, there's a lot of shortcuts, a lot of things you can do by keyboards. It's very interesting to watch, actually. And so I think the two are not incompatible, and actually a lot of things are similar. Like, so shortcuts, keyboard navigation, I would say probably the only so the only space we had to be mindful is screen readers, because it's true that if you have, I don't know, like a table with 1,000 data points,
Right.
how do you do that? And I actually, even when we talk about voice design, I know we had like a proof of concept that we're trying to see how we could do voice design with this kind of very heavy financial table. But so far, yeah, well, if anyone listens and have found the perfect solution, please reach out and contact me, because I think this is where we're kind of reaching the end, like the limits of voice design. Because honestly, if you have to go through like a financial table, doing it by voice, I mean, today having a screen and a mouse is still like more efficient than doing anything by voice. We still haven't cracked it so far.
And something I've run into in the past in more complex interfaces is the users need to see a lot of information at a glance. So they don't want to interact with anything. They just want to look up at a screen, for example, and see the information that they need. A great example from the past is an interface change that I saw users interacting with, where they had to mouse over for information that used to be just scannable. And they weren't happy because now they need to interact with the UI in order to see information that used to be at a glance. So to your point, oversimplification is not necessarily always the answer, especially in enterprise.
Yeah, again, it's like, so I actually did a talk about this, and I really wanted to find something that everyone can relate to. And since the talk is mainly for designers, what I've done is I actually used like one of the module of Photoshop, I think the one that you use to set up the character styling. And I've actually converted it following all the golden rules of form design you can find on Medium, again, Dribble, etc. So, everything is one column, a label, and then the input form, step by step, 5-step. And so that very tiny little like module in Photoshop became a huge 5-step process. And I think this, when designers say it, it's very, I think it's very visually, I think they can really relate to that, because they wouldn't want to use such a thing. So every time you want to change a style, going through a form of 5 steps is like a hassle for designers.
Right.
So what I like to say is like, you wouldn't want to use a tool like that because you're a design professional. So don't do that to your professional users.
Yep. Are there instances where it is important to do some simplification in these complex enterprise applications? Are there typical areas of a UI that need more simplification than others?
Yeah, I tend to say this is kind of my team's playground, because especially when we work on kind of redesigns of like legacy tools, and again, this is a classic mistake where people have thought that because the user are experts on, I don't know, certain financial topic, they can just kind of vomit all the data into one page and, users will deal with it. And then what you end up is having a lot of hierarchy problems, or, and when there's too much, you can't see anything. There's no hierarchy or, too much information. And so that's why I like to say that this is our playground, because what we try to do is reach this kind of simplicity, but not simplistic.
Yep.
And so I would say this is our bread and butter, honestly.
Simplicity without being simplistic. I love it. Are there any design tips or things you've learned from users that help you achieve that?
So I think it's in the chapter, but I like to say that what really helped us the most, and I guess probably because I'm biased coming from business, but I know that designers, when they start something, they like to start in, Post-it notes, design tools. What we're doing, and I over the years, that's kind of like a common practice now in the team, is like we actually start in Excel. And sometimes people are like, what? And Excel to this day is probably the best tool to really work on the hierarchy of information. Because in Excel, they really have to focus on their data. They can't, start thinking about how they want to lay it out, etc. So we actually do a lot of data modeling in Excel. And this is actually before doing any design work, because if you try to do the data modeling and the design work, whether it's like high-fi or low-fi, at the same time, as a designer, that's really a lot to manage. And potentially, even as a designer in any, I guess, complex industry, you first have to understand, okay, how people approach the data and what they do with it. And that's why kind of limiting, it's a bit like saying, you know, when you go low fidelity, you get better feedback in terms of, you know, structure of your information and page. Here's the same. Even before talking about the structure of the page, we need to talk about the structure of the information. And so, yeah, kind of operating within the limits of Excel.
Yep.
Make sure that we don't get all the comments, you know, like, is that color right? Is this logo big enough? You know, is this the right icon? All this, okay, at some point we'll talk about it, but not now.
Yep. Working in Excel to focus on the content so people won't be distracted by the design and the interactions, sounds like.
Yeah, so I like to joke and say, hey, we're doing low fidelity design work in Excel.
I love it. No, that's low fidelity, content first designing right there in a complex environment. So Excel lends itself to that for the data modeling. It's fascinating.
Yeah, and so again, still doing the same joke. We're like, oh, you know, you can actually use a test Excel, and we've done it with clients on some specific, very kind of financially stuff. We're like, and actually, like a lot of time, the kind of MVP is an Excel file, because we were like, okay, is that everything you need in terms of data? And for them, because they also probably have Excel, you know, as a tool. It's easier even for them to kind of say, okay, I want this information, I want that. So there is some, obviously some projects where the first step is actually kind of doing like this kind of small MVP in Excel. And then when you realize that, okay, all the data is there, this is to our best knowledge what the clients need, the user needs, then you can, you know, start then thinking about the rest of the experience.
Neat. That's very cool. Thanks for sharing that.
You're welcome.
For the last portion here, we'd love to get a tip from you for folks either breaking into UX or continuing their UX career. What's a tip that you have for some of our listeners?
Kind of related to the chapter, my tip, I think, would be that there is no magic formula. UX design is a job where you learn by doing, and also because the practices evolve all the time. If you look at what happens with design system, I think after a year it's completely different now. Even with design tools. So there's no, you know, this tool is better than the other, because at some point tools gonna change as well. And I know that when you first start, it's very overwhelming, because first you have to understand, kind of absorb all the words about design, all the terms, high fidelity, low fidelity, user testing, usability testing, you know, all this. And then on top of that, then you can read everything that people is writing on, you know, Medium, which is a good thing. You know, I think as an industry, not a lot of industry is sharing as much as us, you know, in the tech industry in general. So that's great.
We do share a lot.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. And even like when I was on the financial side, there was no sharing like that. And I don't think anyone would want to, you know, spend their weekends writing an article on structured products, for example.
Right.
But because there's so much content, sometimes, I feel it's kind of overwhelming. And I guess what I come to realize and what I say all the time is, this is not mathematics. There's no the solution. And especially like for people who work with a lot of engineers, this mindset is completely different, because we're dealing with people here. We're dealing with different cultures, different industries, different practices. So something that works somewhere might not be, you know, the right thing for you. There's no absolute best solution. And it all depends. I guess that's why it's very upsetting, you know, like the designers say, oh, it depends. But it really depends.
It's funny. It's the first time "it depends" has come up in the podcast, but I mean that is the catchphrase of UX. It always depends on the context, on the people, on everything.
Yeah, and it's so funny because like I'm trying to explain that to projects, because sometimes they think, oh, but I've used the design system and I've done exactly like this project who worked with a designer, so we're good, right? And I'm like, but you want to do that. Like, users need to do that on your project, so it's not going to work. And for them, they don't understand because like they've ticked all the boxes. They used all the right tools. And then the designer arrives and says, it depends.
Right. Well, and we're never done. The world is always changing. Interfaces are always changing. And the mindset of just putting something out there in the world and you're done is no longer the case.
Yeah, so that's why there's no magic formula. Obviously, take advantage that so much is shared, but you really have to make informed decisions. So read a lot, yeah, it's great, but you don't have to copy paste something that works somewhere, thinking that will work for you. That's not usually the case.
Great. So Morgane, thank you so much for joining the podcast here and for writing your chapter in the book. Not all interfaces need to be simplified. It's been wonderful chatting with you today.
Thanks for having me. And it was a great experience writing the book with you.
Wonderful. Thanks for that. Great. And thanks for joining us today, everyone. I hope you enjoyed this episode. You've been listening to the 97 UX Things podcast, a companion to the book 97 Things Every UX Practitioner Should Know, published by O'Reilly and available at your local bookshop. All book royalties go to UX nonprofits, as will any funds raised by this podcast. The theme music is Moisturize the Situation by Consider the Source. Joshua Berlin is the podcast transcript editor, and I'm your host and book editor, Dan Berlin. Please remember to find the needs in your community and fill them with your best work. Thanks for listening.